15. One of the more charming tales attached to Alexander involves his relationship with his horse, Bucephalus. Aeschines has done his part to perpetuate this myth, and it is true that the king had a special connection to this animal, which had begun when he was a boy in Macedon, and lasted beyond the battle at the Hypdaspes. Little Bucephalus would suffer no one else but little Alexander to ride him, and as the years and the distance accumulated, the king took care to lighten his burden as much as possible to prolong his life. What is less often remarked, however, is that Bucephalus was a cantankerous nag. Being the royal favorite, the animal seemed to believe that he himself was king. No other horses could be grazed with him, even ones much larger in size, because Bucephalus would pick fights. He would usually lose against bigger, stronger cavalry mounts. But the risk of injury to Bucephalus always resulted in the other horse being removed or killed. The grooms swore that the horse seemed to know this, and actively schemed to destroy his rivals. Even the people obliged to care for him grew to fear him. To care for the king's mount became dangerous duty, as a long line of grooms were attacked or stepped upon. One boy, a Persian of long experience at the stables at Susa, was kicked fatally in the chest by Bucephalus. Perhaps all this had something to do with the horse's disappearance one day, when the army was camped several parasangs east of the Swat River. That horses died or vanished on campaign was not unusual. The Bactrians and the Sogdians were accomplished rustlers, and wolves and lions lived in the more remote places. Difficult animals had a way of coming up lame or tied up when they injured the wrong person, though ordinary cavalrymen were free to keep a close eye on their own horses. The king naturally could do no such thing. Alexander flew into a rage at the loss of his horse, where in other cases wild replacements could be captured out on the hoof or found among reinforcements from home. Bucephalus himself could not be replaced. The king, therefore, summoned Python, who in turn called a meeting of all cavalry officers down to the tetrarchs. They were given a message to distribute to the natives. If Bucephalus was not returned alive by noon the next day, all their villages would be put to the torch, their men killed, and their women and children sold into slavery. Bucephalus reappeared the next morning. He was hungry and muddy-flanked, but otherwise his old miserable self. The mystery of his disappearance and reappearance was never solved. That the king would make such a threat, however, said much about the precarious state of mind. I have no doubt he would have made good on it. At the very last, thousands of innocent people living over hundreds of square miles had been driven into panic, all for the sake of a horse. When the detestable creature did die shortly after the battle at the Hypdaspes River, there was quiet rejoicing all over the Macedonian camp. Yes, I was to blame for encouraging Alexander in these whims because I wanted to save him from his despair over Clytus. My goal was to save his sanity, but I discovered that his apotheosis had only bought us all time. In the end, his new grand proportions only seemed to make his fallibilities more grand. As it happened, I did get one last glimpse of a younger, less encumbered Alexander. We had camped some miles west of the Indus, on some high ground, when the wind came in from the northern wastelands. The sudden cold sent the men scrambling for supplies of firewood, which was scarce at that altitude. We were fortunate, however, to find a good supply of cedar wood boxes scattered over the slope, each filled with what we took to be flammable rags. After burning several hundred of these, the Macedonians were comfortable, but the people of the nearby town were in an uproar. It seems that we had burned the ancestors of these natives, who had a custom of leaving their coffins above ground. Armed men sallied up from the valley. There was a brief clash. The attackers retired, and Alexander prepared to lay siege to their town. It was at this point that the townspeople sought a parley, and in a haunting repetition of our encounter with the Bruncadii, they addressed us in Greek. Indeed, their dialect was an archaic one that was much closer to the Macedonian argot. Unlike the Bruncadii, however, they did not request Alexander to spare their town, but demanded it, for it seems the founder of their city was Dionysus himself. That would be Dionysus. That was their claim. Fittingly, the name of the place was Nysa. In a bygone age, the god of wine and ecstasy had passed this way on his return journey from India. A number of the god's followers, on seeing how appropriate the place was for cultivating the grape, decided to stay. Dionysus blessed their endeavor with prosperity, and indeed, all around them, the Macedonians found reminders of home, vineyards, of course, but also clematis, ivy, laurel, oak, poplar, acanthus, and myrtle. None of these had been seen in such profusion since we had crossed the Hellespont. As a final proof, the Nicens said that the mountain above their town was called Meron, the thigh. To the Macedonians, this name was a clear reference to Dionysus's birth out of the thigh of Zeus. So instead of laying siege, Alexander made sacrifices to Dionysus and Zeus Ammon. The Nicens, pleased, invited the king and his officers to sample the hospitality of the god. Craterus, Perdiccas, and the rest thought themselves above such frivolity. However, Vespasian was off managing the construction of a bridge over the Indus. So our party on the mountain was therefore a small one, just Alexander, myself, Rojan, and Bagoas. If there is one truth in life, it is that we remember every moment of a dull party, but all too little of a good one. Our day and night on the slopes of Mount Meron exists in the mind now as images only, savored, to be sure, but without a story to put them to. I do know that we began by drinking wine, neat from silver cups. Somehow, as the god took hold, Alexander ended up in woman's clothes, with fawn skin tunic, fennel garland, and rouge smeared on his cheeks. Looking down, I saw I was dressed the same way, though I must have made a very ugly woman. Then we were running under the pines, on the soft grass, leaping and laughing and like delighted children. As our intoxication deepened, we were encouraged by attributes of Dionysus that seemed miraculously placed for our use. Musical instruments hanging from boughs, more wine, figs out of season. At the base of the bay tree, Bagoas found a thyrus wound with ivy, and for reasons known only to himself, used it to strike the ground there. From where the thyrus struck, the earth flowed a stream of thick goat's milk. We fell to our knees and elbows, lapping up the milk, as Dionysus seemed to stand over us, a tinkle of cymbals like laughter wafting down from unseen branches. Bagoas, his mouth and jaw lathered in cream, looked up at Alexander and kissed him on the lips. Then he did the same to me as Rogaine sat back against the trunk, caressing herself down the neck and between the breast, in beastly, contented remoteness. I think there must have been something in the milk, for my recollections get more indistinct from there. There was more running and calling of the Bacchic refrain. Uoi, saboy, uoi, saboy. A nest of fat snakes appeared in our path. The snakes seemed drugged, sluggish. Rogaine tore into one of them with her teeth, ripped off the living flesh, and swallowed the chunks. Alexander, pleased, took the head for himself, while Bagoas performed a sinuous, serpent-like dance. Much aroused by this, the king grasped him by the flanks and buggered him in the sight of heaven. Yet not even this seemed strange to me, as Rogaine and I shared a winking glance, and the queen lay back in my arms, with my hand entwined in her thin, blood-caked fingers. Through our frenzy, we became conscious of our urgent sensation in our throats. We had to come upon a cold, clear stream before we realized that the sensation was thirst, and that we were parched from what must have been hours of exertion. We bowed and drank like things of the forest, stopping only when our bellies were full, and we could hardly turn our backs to the smooth creekside rocks, warmed by the sun. Lulled by the song of the cicada, we fell into a deep, untroubled sleep. When we woke, the sun was down near the shoulder of Meron. My head was a bit clearer, and I could see the evidence Bagoas and Rogaine bore of their experience: cuts on their feet, burrs in their hair, blood and milk on their chins. Alexander was standing some distance away, looking through the trees down to the valley below. Evening shadow had fallen on the Macedonian camp. Torches winked in the distance, arranged along the ranks of tents. The king had an odd expression on his face, both curious and wistful, as if he were regarding evidence of an ancestor's life. I plucked the half-crushed garland from his head and tossed it aside. The sundown watch must be coming on, he told me. Look, the 3rd Battalion of footmen still can't pitch a straight line of tents. Shall we get back? He sighed, and putting his weight on my shoulder, remarked, It's always there, is it not? Somewhere around me like the Furies. Jealousy. Blood avenger, unceasing pursuit. Other men have gone abroad, explored foreign lands. I must take an army with me to see new places. The original blunt instrument. I love them so much, I would run away right now. I wonder if you understand, dear Macon. I thought it best to say I did not, but he continued to walk with me as we descended the mountain. Bagoas and Rogaine stumbling behind us in the twilight. As we proceeded, it became clear that we had waited too long to start back. The light was failing, and the path was little more than a deer track. Soon we lost our way, but pressed on down the slope. Finally the ground leveled, and we came upon the outskirts of a village we hadn't passed on the way up. Alexander called for the little column to halt. "Is this Niza?" he asked. "I doubt it," I answered, "but I may not have seen it from this side." "There, someone's coming." Bagoas pointed. 3 women appeared. They were neither girls nor particularly old, young mothers perhaps. Their heads were covered with parti-colored cloths, their hands hidden behind the folds of their dresses. They were approaching a flat stone scattered with flowers and spice leaves. Spreading a cloth on the ground there, one of the women dumped a handful of small objects in the center. In the gloom, it was hard to see what, but they appeared to be either chickpeas or some kind of nut. As the woman in the Middle East set about picking chaff out of her nuts or peas, the other 2 looked reverently at the flat rock. It occurred to me then that they may have come together to a village shrine for some kind of observance. To be watching them secretly, therefore, seemed to be something of a transgression, though of what faith I had no idea. I swallowed my qualms, though, when it was clear that the others would not move on. The woman in the center began to speak in a language I couldn't understand. Cocking her ear, Rojaine gave a little gasp, then a smile of recognition. We all looked at her. "She is not speaking Sogdian, but I understand some of it. They are performing the rite we call miserable peas. It is done by women only in times of trouble in the family. I used to see it done by my grandmother. We also used chickpeas." As the woman spoke, the others knelt by her, giving affirmations now and then, though they did it somewhat perfunctorily, as if they had heard her words many times before. "What's going on now?" asked Bagoas. "There is a tale that must be told before the peas are purified and given away. In my father's kingdom, the story is about the wise daughter of the goatherd. There was a drought, and there was no food for the girl, her father, or the goats. The goatherd prayed to Amaratat for aid, and Yazata appeared to them with the gift of a handful of chickpeas. The Shining One said, 'Purify these as you know how, and after the rite, give them away as best serves the good.' The father gave thanks, but when Amiratat was gone, he complained that the Spenta had given no help at all, for they had been given only a few miserable chickpeas, and he was about to share them with his daughter for eating, when he begged him to purify them first. 'Foolish girl,' her father said. 'Purified or not, these miserable peas will not save us.' But her piety shamed him, and he relented, saying the words that consecrated them in the sight of Ahura Mazda. Again, he was about to eat them when his daughter objected, saying she wanted to give her share to the goats. 'Foolish child,' the goatherd chided her. 'What good will a few miserable peas do for one whole flock?' The wise daughter replied, 'I know not, father, but I cannot eat while others suffer, even if they are animals.' At these words, the goatherd was proud of his daughter's sense of duty to Asia, and ashamed at having indulged his despair. He bid her to eat her share of the peas and give his to the goats instead. When she threw her father's peas among the flock, a miracle happened. Where each pea hit the ground, a beautiful green tree sprouted, grew, and ripened before her eyes, until she was standing in a grove of myrtle trees, each with boughs groaning under the weight of berries. In this way the goats, the father and the daughter, ate, and were saved from the drought. Soon the prince of the kingdom came by, and seeing a grove of myrtle more splendid than in any of his father's gardens, came to the door to congratulate the owner. There he saw the goatherd's daughter, and fell in love. When she came of age, he married her, and in due course she became queen. But for the rest of her life, in trouble or not, she was sure to perform this rite of the chickpeas to protect her family from harm. Rojan finished the tale long before the other did. When the village woman was finished, she said a short prayer over the chickpeas in a different tongue. I took to be Avestan, the language of Zarathustra's revelation. When that was done, the three women solemnly scattered some of the chickpeas on the shrine, and threw others on the roofs of the houses around them. This land is not in drought, Alexander remarked in a loud, too loud, a voice. The woman looked in his direction, and seeing us crouching there, turned away in fear. Alexander stepped into the open to appeal to them. Maids, stop! You have nothing but compassion to expect from the hand of your king. His words had the opposite effect. Instead of simply running away, the women began to shriek, Deva! Deva! When he followed them through the narrow lanes of the village, the people scattered. Women dropped their baskets and ran into their houses. Little children fled into the mother's arms, crying, Deva! Deva! Alexander, still convinced he could soothe their fears, went from door to door as they slammed in his face, and though he was oblivious to it, he was a frightful sight, with his face rouged with snake blood and his woman's dress caked in mud. Persistent, he chased them all, holding out his arms in a supplicatory gesture, and promised to swallow them up. At last he relented, sitting against a wall. We caught up to him as he slumped there. I take it, then, that we are not in Nysa, said Bagoas. Not in Nysa, indeed, for it was clear that the Macedonian foraging parties had already visited this place, and their exactions had caused the hunger that the miserable peas were supposed to remedy. More than mere thievery seemed involved. I had seen the same headlong flight, the same abject terror, among the women of the small village before, in Doris, north of Amphissa, after Philip's army had come through in the maneuvers that led to Chaeronea. It must have been much the same in Thebes or Attica during the Persian occupation, or in Ionia after the revolt failed. Places where men once lived, worked, made love, became hunted places. The presence of those missing was still palpable, and every pair of eyes, including the children's, seemed to contain a story that they would sooner forget, but would tell for the rest of their lives. I should add that Alexander, like Philip before him, expressly forbade disrespect of women, the elderly, or children. In Bactria, there had been a man in my battalion, the 2nd Hypaspis, who had been given the rather arbitrary sounding punishment of 182 strokes of the lash. The number was based on an estimate of the number of women he had raped in the lands of Persia, Hyrcania, and Bactria. The man did not survive the putrefaction of the wounds he received during the scourging. Yet not even this example had brought safety, it seemed, to the people of that village at the foot of Mount Meron. "I think," said Alexander very deliberately, "that I shall be glad when this is all over." "16. The army pressed on to the Indus. The huge bridge of boats assembled by Hephaestion was sturdy enough for 80,000 Macedonians and 20,000 horses, but still failed to inspire any respect for him. As usual, the way was smoothed by the surrender of the next kingdom to the east, in this case a character named Aemhe, or Omphis, as Aeschines called him, a more self-interested climber we had not encountered in 8 years of campaigning in Asia. Already under severe pressure from the two Indian kings to his east, Albasares of Kashmir and Porus of the Pauravas, Aemhe made a profound gesture of surrendering what was barely his in the first place. Moreover, Aemhe overdid his show in nearly disastrous fashion by assembling his entire army before the gates of Taxila, his capital. He so alarmed the Macedonians that they rushed to organize a defense. The confusion was only resolved when Aemhe came out to surrender personally. Alexander met him in the center, both men now a picture of fraternal goodwill, both smiling, both unable to understand a word the other said. As expected, the toady was confirmed in his kingship by Alexander, whereupon he changed his name to Taxiles. This struck me as odd, something like Alexander styling himself as King Pella. In any case, the Macedonians made such an impression that Taxiles' enemy, Abisares, sent tokens of submission. This left only King Porus to oppose their invasion of the Gangetic plain. Beyond that, the Macedonians expected only to find the eastern limit of the continent washed by the waters of unending ocean. Each time the corporation known as Alexander called upon the skills of Aridaeus, it took a risk. Accordingly, it made a number of sincere efforts to persuade, overawe, threaten, and otherwise motivate Porus to give up his enmity against Taxiles. But this Porus was a stiff-necked fellow, repeatedly sending back the Macedonian envoys. The final time he added a promise. Porus would indeed greet Alexander at the Hydaspes River, but only at the head of his army. And when Porus takes the field, the message read, it is not to stage a pageant like Aemhe, but to make war. So war it was. Aemhe warned the king that Porus was a formidable foe, with a well-trained army and a large corps of war elephants. Far from giving Alexander pause, this news delighted him, for he was tired of petty conflicts with brigands and hill tribes, and longed for a good, pitched, set-piece battle. The Hydaspes is only a tributary of the Indus, but no trickle like the Granicus. It was deep and fast enough to prevent a crossing in all but a few well-known places. Porus blocked them all with an army of 30,000 infantry, 4,000 horses, and 200 elephants. Except for the elephants, the Pauravas force was smaller than Alexander's, but had the advantage of the best ground, and the knowledge that they were fighting for to stop the man who had toppled the empire. But had the advantage of the best ground, and the knowledge that they were fighting for their homes and children. The Macedonians were exhausted, ignorant of the territory, and far from home. For these reasons, it would seem Porus believed he had a chance to stop the man who had toppled the empire at his doorstep. Porus was clearly not a man to be panicked by a quick offensive thrust. Instead, Alexander opened the battle with a series of cavalry feints up and down the river. In response, the Pauravas elephants and horsemen went out to shadow the Macedonians, massing at the points where Alexander's cavalry bluffed a crossing. The Macedonians kept this up for several nights, whooping and carousing as they galloped, more or less telling the Indians exactly where they were. With this tactic, Alexander so exhausted the enemy that they ceased to respond to these moves in force, for it is not an easy thing to get a corps of elephants on the march. Instead, Porus convinced himself that Alexander would not attack at all that season, but would wait for the late summer when the water level would be more suited to an attack. Having lulled the Pauravas into complacence, Alexander slipped out of the camp and surveyed a crossing Iamhe had pointed out to him some distance to the north. The river was deep there, but narrower. Judging the ford to be manageable, he ordered his men to construct rafts as they had on the Danube and the Oxus, and also to bring forward one of the large galleys he had disassembled at the Indus and portage to the Hydaspes. Though no enemy scouts had appeared on the opposite bank that far north, Alexander felt obliged to wait for the most opportune moment to cross, for the Macedonian reputation of invincibility was at stake. His moment came 2 nights later, when a great rainstorm broke over the battlefield, with storm clouds blocking the moon and the rain and thunder muffling their maneuvers. Alexander moved the bulk of his army to the crossing place. Craterus was left opposing Porus with a small force that kept up a large number of campfires to fool the enemy into believing the Macedonians had not moved. An officer named Attalus, who was about Alexander's height and coloring, was dressed in the king's clothes and diadem, so the Indians would not think the king had left the camp. Finally, Craterus was given orders to cross the river when Porus decamped, and to follow the sound of the battle wherever it might be. The crossing was accomplished before dawn without the loss of a single man. Alexander drew his men into formation. expecting to receive a counterattack at any moment. His scouts then returned with disturbing news. The Macedonians had not landed on the opposite bank of the Hydaspes, but on an island in the stream. An additional crossing would be needed before he could engage the enemy. His men were now stranded uselessly, while back at the main Macedonian camp, the diminished size of Craterus's holding force would become obvious as the sun rose. It was not in Alexander's character to rage at Iambe's bad advice, but only to apply himself with greater resolution. The island had at least shielded his army from the eyes of Porus' scouts. His men proceeded across the arm of the Hydaspes without delay, sinking up to their necks in raging snowmelt. Weapons disappeared in the current. Horses and men lost their footing and floated away. The bulk of the Macedonian forces completed their second crossing of the morning just as a mounted detachment of Indians finally sighted them. The horsemen attacked, but upon seeing that the phalanx was safely across the deployed, turned and fled. There was a skirmish as the cavalry companions intercepted the Indians. One of Porus's sons was killed after a brave struggle, but the bulk of his force escaped. From across the river, Craterus witnessed riders arrive in Porus's camp with news of Alexander's appearance on the east bank. The king of Poravus ordered his men to march north, leaving only a token force to prevent Craterus from following him. The last of his elephants departed just as the bodies and sarissas of the drowned Macedonians floated past the Indian camp. The armies met on flat ground, hopefully to nullify Alexander's skill at wide cavalry sweeps, and knowing that the horses of the Macedonians were terrified of the elephants. Porus pushed the larger creatures far forward. Iambe, however, had told Alexander that the Indian Mahouts had never faced an army of well-drilled pikemen. Alexander sent word to his infantry to be ready as he feinted with his cavalry. The Pauravas took the bait, sending out their horsemen to chase away the Macedonians. Just as the Indian army split in two, Alexander ordered the foot companions forward, brandishing their sarissas under the snouts of the elephants. For a few moments the battle hung in the balance, as Porus's infantry held firm against the Macedonian attack. His elephants, tusks raised, charged into the Macedonian ranks, snorting and trampling, plucking unlucky Phalagnites out of the ranks with their trunks. The victims were suspended helplessly by their legs before the Indians dispatched them. Archers stationed on the elephants' backs fired into the phalanxes from above, doing great damage. The Macedonians tried to use their pikes against the eyes of the elephants. The elephants were most sensitive about wounds to their trunks, which they held out of reach of the soldiers. The Pauravas Mahouts were much more skilled than those hired by the Persians at Gaugamela. Porus's elephant corps did its job very well, keeping the Macedonians away from the Indian center, just as it was ordered to do. The heads of the creatures were armored, so it was difficult work to damage them. The Pauravas sallied out against the phalanx several times, their tuskers working terrible carnage against the foot companions, who often could not generate enough force behind their sarasses to pierce their thick hides. The Macedonians finally used their war axes against the elephants, chopping at their trunks until they were severed or too mangled for use. In agony, their eyes put out, the giants soon went out of control, thrashing at anything in their reach, including their Indian masters. The Pauravas cavalry, having made no headway against the mounted companions and Thessalians, added to the chaos by returning to the center. The Indians' fate was sealed when Craterus appeared at their rear, charging on the double upon them. Porus tried to organize his army into a defensive square, but as Aridaeus had envisioned, his elephants could not turn around quickly enough. With the luxury to charge the Indians at a run, the Macedonians put their lances right through the shields and leather armor of the enemy. This triggered the final panic and sealed the victory for the Macedonians. Surrounded, Porus's army became a bloody, mud-spattered confusion of men, horses, and elephants, all doing as much damage to each other as to the Macedonians. Alexander ordered the phalanx on his left to withdraw, opening a path for the survivors to escape, for it seems that already before the battle was over, Alexander had plans for Porus and his gallant fighters. To my mind, this victory came as hard as any fought by the Macedonians in Asia. Alexander's infantry was the most demoralized after this battle than after any other. The 1,000 men lost at the Hydaspes and the way many of them had been crushed to death made the Macedonians very reluctant to meet any more elephants in the future. And India, as everyone knows, is the wrong place to go if you fear these animals. Alexander sent his ally to solicit Porus's surrender, but when Iamhe rode before the Indian king and addressed him in his own tongue, Porus turned his elephant to attack, declaring, "A crown yields only to a crown, not a dog." Iamhe escaped, telling Alexander a story that the Pauravas monarch preferred death to capture, but Alexander saw through this, having a better understanding of the proud king's mind. He then obliged Iamhe to return with him as his translator. Confronting Porus, Alexander dismounted and made such signals as to indicate he wished to parley. Porus, staring down on his adversary from the biggest war elephant on the field, halted. While he was not out of his mind, as Iamhe suggested, he must have been troubled by the 9 wounds he had received that day, and the ordeal of witnessing all 3 of his grown sons killed. He might have tried to run his enemy right down then, but with his army destroyed and his kingdom's fate sealed, such spite would have gained him nothing. Instead, he stepped onto his elephant's bent front leg. The beast gently lowered its master to the ground before Alexander. The Pauravas king was a giant, nearly 8 feet tall, with a crest on his helmet that made him seem taller still. His posture there was unbowed and unafraid, though he had no fewer than 3 arrows still stuck in his body. Alexander seemed little more than a child standing before his father, except that it had been the Macedonian who had come to give the lesson that day. "Tell me why you fought me," Alexander asked him, "when you see your rival here has profited by forswearing the sword." Porus answered, "If you had come to me in friendship, it is you who would have profited. I can ask for no worthier opponent. Therefore, tell me how you should be treated, and it shall be so. As a king, no more, no less. It shall be as you wish for your kingdom, and for yourself. Whatever you desire is yours. What may I give you? I have given you my answer. Give to a king as a king ought. And give Alexander did. Perhaps because he was angry at the poor intelligence on the river crossing, or perhaps because Porus presented the kind of ally he trusted more at his back, he did not give the Pauravas kingdom to Iamhe. Instead, he confirmed Porus as ruler for all lands between the Hydaspes and the Essenes, and went on to enlarge his kingdom with lands around the Hydraotes. In return, he stipulated that Porus would contribute as many garrison troops and all the elephants he could spare to the Macedonian army. Porus, for his part, accepted his responsibility and discharged it faithfully in the campaigns that followed against the Kethai tribe, so that Alexander's realm ran to the west bank of the Hyphasis. Beyond the river beckoned the great Gangetic plain. There is one other detail Aeschines failed to mention in his account of this time. In the chaos of the end of the battle, a crazed, blinded elephant veered into the Macedonian line. Undeterred by lances or arrows, this elephant charged through a phalanx 16 shields deep, turned left, and ran right over Aridaeus and his screen of protectors. All the guards on the exposed side were crushed. Aridaeus was thrown when his horse panicked, and kicked by a hoof as his mount escaped. This was the worst sort of disaster for the Macedonians. Alexander abandoned his chivalrous interview with Porus the second he got the news. The royal doctor was summoned, and the tent thrown up over Aridaeus' body to conceal the incident. Soon Alexander and his staff learned the diagnosis. His brother had been struck in the side of his head. An all-enclosing Corinthian helmet had not protected him, but added to the injury by shattering with the impact. Lacerations had caused him to lose much blood. He was alive, but unconscious in a way that did not promise he would ever recover. And so the campaign was both literally and figuratively at a crossroads. Among the generals who ran the army, there seemed a real possibility that all of Asia would bow to a Macedonian master, and consequently to governors selected from among themselves. Yet without Aridaeus, how would they ever defeat the great king of India? For surely the wealthy lands around the Ganges must support a powerful kingdom. No one knew for sure what lay ahead, but imagination filled in the details. The Indian monarch must have an army of 500,000 men, with elephants twice as large and 10 times more numerous than those of Porus. Not knowing what to do, the Macedonians did what they always done, march east. By then, they were suffering from the almost constant rain of the part of the world The heavens opened every day, letting down a streaming torrent that rusted armor and rotted wounds. Spoiled food and contaminated water fouled the stomachs of the men, and the stench of widespread diarrhea gave away the army's position to anyone with a nose. To give his men some relief from the heat, Alexander took care to march in the shadow of whether high ground was available. But this was meager in the region. These and other miserable conditions conspired to make a crossing of the Acasians River an expensive proposition. The river was almost 2 miles wide in the spring, and the natives, by now aware that the Macedonians would seize any vessels they found, hid or scuttled all their boats. Alexander, therefore, had to dig deeply into the huge fortune he had raided from Persia to purchase the transport he needed. There were 2 deaths around this time that did not come on the battlefield, but that each affected Alexander in its own way. First, Bucephalus at last passed on from old age. Alexander grieved for him as he would for a close comrade, and erected a shrine for him on the hillside where his ashes were buried. He also founded a city in the place where he had crossed the Hydaspes on the stormy night, and called it Bucephala, so that the animal's name would forever be on the lips of men. There he settled soldiers who had grown too old to serve him, and those who had married Indian women and wished to stay, with his blessing, in the lands they had conquered. The other death was of Darius's mother, Sisygambis. She had been ailing for some time, and had long expressed, through intermediaries, that she preferred to return to Persia. But Alexander, perhaps out of affection for the kind of mother Olympias never was, kept the old woman close to him. In any case, the heat and constant rain of India in that season wore her down, until at last she stopped eating, and called for Alexander from her deathbed. The latter, coming into her presence, was shocked and saddened by her wasted appearance. Kneeling at her side, he begged that she might live to see the shore of the great Eastern Ocean with him. At this she laughed at him. "You are a fool. Neither of us will live to see the Eastern Ocean." "Why not?" "Because Asia is not little Europe, my dear boy. Its vastness exceeds your imagining, with kingdoms beyond India you cannot conquer in 5 lifetimes. For your happiness, be content with what you have accomplished. Make an heir with that half-wild woman of yours. That is my testament to you." And with that, she allowed him to kiss her hand, and ordered him to leave her, for she wished to die with the survivors of her royal household around her, as she was attended in happier times. And when word came that she was gone, Alexander mourned, putting off eating and washing for 3 days. He sent her body home unburned, so that she might be buried whole, in accord with the Persian custom.